we are honored to have Nimmi Gowrinathan with us today to discuss issues related to why women choose violence in the context of her new publication, Radicalizing Her. I personally met her at Syracuse University, so I hope you all enjoy as much as I did when we discussed this topic in New York. So I inform everyone that this session is being recorded, so please turn off your cameras if you wish, and you will be able to make questions and talk to the author at the end using either the mic or the chat. So Nimmi, welcome to the association. Thanks for accepting to be with us today. Our students are really excited to get to know you beyond the book that they just read. So let me just briefly introduce you. Nimmi Gowrinathan is an activist, a writer, scholar, and founder of the Politics of Sexual Violence initiative, where she directs Beyond Identity, a gendered platform for scholar activists in the City College of New York. She is the publisher of Adi magazine and the creator of the Female Fighter series at Guernica magazine. Her political essays, described as the search for answers, as it appears in the Publishers Weekly, have appeared in Harper's Magazine, Freeman's Journal, Guernica magazine, and the Foreign Affairs, among others. So I'll start this session making an overview of some autobiographical works that were published in the aftermath of the Sri Lanka War that goes from 1983 to 2009, which seemed to push the boundaries of the discourse on women, violence, and terror. The Sri Lankan Civil War, or the Land War, was the armed conflict fought from 1883 to 2009 by the government of Sri Lanka and the LTTE, which aimed to create an independent Tamil state called Tamil Elam in the north of the east of Sri Lanka. So after 26 years of military campaign, the Sri Lankan military defeated the Tamil Tigers through heavy military measures in May 2009. So the war caused significant hardships for the population in all areas, with an estimated of, if I'm not wrong, if my sources are not wrong, 80,000, between 80,000 and 100,000 people killed during this course. So the increasingly visibility of armed women at the forefront in violent conflicts in the modern world has unsettled conventional beliefs of inferiority, weakness, innocence, and the resultant fragility and bitterhood of women. So I'll just make a very brief analysis of the representation of armed women in the LTT organization, with assumption that the genders of autobiography offer an alternative archive within which similarly polarized truth entrenched in nationalist conflicts can be explored in their nuanced complexity and challenge conventional history and narratives. So my discussion, to start with this, concentrates around the controversy arising in feminist scholarship regarding the portrayal of armed women and its numerous implications, as the overall interpretation of female militancy seems heavily polarized. So some argue that women's political violence becomes an uncomfortable black hole, wherein women's agency, because violent, becomes a male patriarchal project, and therefore female militants become pawns and victims in the discourse of nationalist patriarchy. And others interpret female militancy as empowerment, with clear nationalist aspirations and articulated motives for the ethnic struggles. So I hope that this will serve as an introduction to our invited speaker today. The autobiographical expands the boundaries of discourse by intervening with the voice of the individual, narrating personal truths, life stories from a fictional point of view that may unsettle the dominant narratives. So in doing so, the discussion of many of these post-war texts intends to assess how literary portrayals of female militancy vis-a-vis violence, empowerment, and victimhood challenge mainstream history, scholarship, hegemonic narratives of war, and social conventions. And in doing so, contribute to expand the boundaries of our understanding of women and violence in times of violent conflict. So, well, if we just have an overview of how many women militants are out there in the world, we find that there are quite many. There are many reports that have revealed that about 10% of foreign recruits for the ISIS from Europe, North America, and Australia were women. Also, another study conducted in 2017 revealed that out of 434 suicide bombing carried out by Nigeria-based Boko Haram, at least 72% attacks were carried out by women. And there's another study that I have here that says that most of the LTTE suicide bombings that target not only the civil with this profile, but also the military personnel, were carried out by women. So according to my sources, it has been reported that at least half or more than half of the suicide attacks were carried out by women. So there is an increasing visibility of armed women in wars and violent conflicts with numerous interpretations, as I said before. First of all, because it has brought forth a crisis imminence associated with women and femininity in the patriarchal discourse. The armed woman has unsettled conventional beliefs of inferiority, of weaknesses, of innocence, and the resultant fragility and victimhood of women, especially in conflict situations. And second, even the feminist scholarship has been embattled when faced with the figure of the female militant. We have a very influential scholar. I'm not sure if Nimmi, you're in touch with her, the Mel from Sri Lanka. She, for example, points out how the activities of female militants in aggressive right-wing campaigns spelled a crisis for many feminists who had worked on the premise that women were victim survivors rather than perpetrators of violence, and that their entry into public political activity was towards a liberatory politics. So in this context, women's political violence becomes the uncomfortable black hole wherein women's agency, because violent, becomes a male patriarchal project, and female militants become these victims in the discourse of the nationalist patriarchy. So we have that reference from our Sri Lankan feminist scholar. But such a reading can be problematic for a number of reasons. First, because it denies nationalist aspirations in women. It also posits women's emancipation as independent from national and ethnic struggles, and paints female militants whose articulated motives behind joining the LTTE are nationalist in nature, as misguided souls whose interests are sadly misplaced, and that the real men of steel for the LTTE have been its female suicide bombers, who account for 40% of the suicide activities. So there are other research conducted on the movement that concluded that the LTTE women, like LTTE men, are primarily motivated by nationalist favor. And women of the younger generations of Tamils were as alienated from the state as uninspired by the vision of a liberated elam as their male counterparts. But there are other feminists who have begun to interpret female militancy as empowerment. So at that glance, the overall interpretation of female militancy in feminist scholarship, on the one hand, like it's being polarized, we know the binary nature of the feminist conceptualizations of the woman warrior. One finds in war a potential realm of gendered equality and female liberation. Another associates women with nurturing and life-giving qualities, linking them to an ethos of peace and pitting them for the interest against the war. That's the common version that we get. These perceptions, these polarized perceptions, fail to capture the precarious middle ground, as this other Sri Lankan writer says, Raja Singham Senanayake. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, Nimmi. What she's saying is that LTT women have been portrayed as cogs in the wheel of the female leadership. And the reality of LTT women is probably somewhere in between. So she reflects about the current tendency in scholarship to amalgamate both approaches and perceive women's victimhood and empowerment as simultaneous realities in war. So this is just a summary that I just wanted to make to see how this, the interpretation of why women choose violence is being conducted in the feminist discourse. And well, it's polarized, but now there is another tendency, right, that put them together, that maybe their position is somewhere in the middle. So I'm afraid I don't have time to go through all this. We could say that there are armed women rendered visible now and vocal in this kind of books, and that like Radicalizing Her, and that actually constitutes a threat to patriarchy and war, as violent women in arms are subvert the figuration of women as delicate symbols of home that frame decisions to go to war. And this framing invites critical attention to the call to arms to men to defend their women and children and the fragile motherland. But at the same time, however, the violent potential of armed women can encourage oppressive practices that aim to contain women. So this is all that in between, and that's why we have invited Nimmi here, so that to see if she can clarify that for us a little bit. So I've seen after reading that Radicalizing Her that this kind of narrative, and there are many other narratives that were written by Sri Lankan authors about this topic, present powerful and truthful accounts of female militants with distinctively individual personalities, histories, tragedies, joys, and aspirations. So the nameless terrorist in popular culture is giving a name, a history, and individuality. So in giving a list, a handful of female militants a voice, these narratives interrupt the veil of secrecy and myth that surrounds armed women. So these narratives free the reader from dominant frames of understanding militancy by forcing them to confront their own prejudices and view in a new light the nameless and the faceless other in static narratives that render words just. So Radicalizing Her has the capacity to transcend the epistemological limitations of dominant discourses surrounding conflict and resultant impact, political or affective, or both. It holds the female fighter up in all her complexity as a kind of mirror to contemporary conversations on gender violence and power. But I'll leave it to Nimmi, okay, as we have the privilege of having her among us to tell us about her experience and what brought her actually to write this book. I'm sorry I've really been fast because I was very worried about, coming from one room to the other and not having enough time. So the floor is yours, Nimmi. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm so grateful for the invite. And as always, if folks are reading the book and it's having an impact, it's living out its political task in the world. Of course, the scholars that you mentioned, Nelifar Demal, Rajani Singham Senanayake, Ambika Satyanathan, these are all, I'm very careful to situate my work in what Mariam Kaba calls the lineage of thinking, so it's important, particularly my intellectual work was heavily anchored in the work of the scholarship of these women. I do want to say that a note on form, when we sort of put forward this in the way that scholarship and particularly political science does, we could see it like this, or we could see it like this, or we could see it somewhere in the middle. To me, that kind of division was never satisfactory enough for the female fighter who kind of lived this porous existence, right? Even to say she's somewhere in the middle didn't quite capture, the entirety of that experience, right? And this is where I think the form of the book took shape. This is where I chose this form to be able to capture something that the academic literature was not able to for me. So I think if, it works for you all, I can do a sort of 20-minute talk on the book with some excerpts read, and then really leave most of the time for questions. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Please,
yes, that's perfect.
Okay, so, I'll start by saying that I'm Tamil Sri Lankan, and that is at the heart of all of my work. It always has been, but I was born and raised here in the United States. I'll start with a quote from Saidiya Hartman's beautiful piece on archives. Loss gives rise to longing, and in these circumstances, it would not be far-fetched to consider stories as a form of reparations, perhaps the only kind we will ever receive. So for me, the female fighter is, at best, deeply misunderstood and worst, misjudged. And the closer that I came to these women branded as extreme, the more normal their decisions seemed, less extreme than mundane. And I want to map, I think in the way that this book does, I hope in the way this book does, the larger kind of architectures of oppression, as well as the scenes of life that persist inside this frame, So to reveal both the barriers that limit our view of the female fighter and the intimacy of violence that shapes her own consciousness on the inside. Now, so to the outside world, and this comes from, again, my positioning as not just a scholar, but as an activist, as an advocate, who's constantly sort of presenting the female fighter, particularly to the Western world, And to the Western world, the female fighter is largely a threat to be destroyed, right? And so much of my work came to be why we're not able to see her, first to understand what this barrier was, why we couldn't see the female fighter in her complexity. And this is an excerpt from the book. It is inside the overlapping circles of the moral righteousness of nonviolence and the entrenched beliefs on the inherent nature of women that the female fighter and her motivations are disappeared. If nonviolence is valorized as the only legitimate form of resistance, women are the presumed peaceful, moral core that hold this argument in place. But women in the Tigers and other militant movements did seek a type of power through violence, the power to control the experiences of their everyday existence. So the first barrier one comes across most often is this kind of selective commitment to nonviolence, right? So I study the female fighter who have, of course, women who have chosen violence as a means of resistance. Particularly, I look at the Tigers, a separatist movement in Sri Lanka, whose history of resistance intertwines with my own family histories. And I argue that to understand the role of violence in politics in this space, it must first be extracted from the moral imperative to condemn it, right? And this is a position that I find myself often placed in, to condone or condemn violence, right? But to condone or condemn it from the outside matters very little. Violence is simply a reality in the lives of the women that I've known. In order to end violence, we must first understand the intimate inner workings of violence. If we understand it, as we do now, I think, increasingly, if we understand violence and sexual violence as a political act that disproportionately affects women, then we must be able to see that it will have a political impact. Now, and this is the area that I feel that we're not yet able to understand and to grapple with and really sort of be able to map the contours of that, right? That impact. So where the choice to participate in violence for women is seen as extreme, the violence that led her to the battlefield is a normalized violence of the everyday. The rape that pushes her away from society, the marriage that traps her within it, the military occupation that intrudes on her every movement, and the peaceful savior who seeks to extract her voice from the body politic it inhabits. One of the senior members of the Farc in Colombia, Sandra, who I write about in the book, once said to me, so if a soldier comes at you with a gun, women should respond with what? A Bible, a book, kindness. So this book, Radicalizing Her, initially, and as happened in conversations with the publishers, will be judged by its cover as an active action happening to a powerless her, right? In the early conversations with the publishers, particularly the younger interns, felt that radicalizing her was taking away her agency, right? Whereas in fact, the book is a request to recalibrate, to reverse our view of the target, honing in on the violent state and the society it breeds. These structures, the ones that restrain her movement, disappear when the view of the female fighter is myopic. Those must first be brought into view before they can be seen, studied, and dismantled, an urgent corrective of the innate political power in every woman, right? We spend so much time focused on the her. Why did she make this decision, and not the context around her, the forces that are radicalizing her, So the book is asking us to reverse that view, right? And really to make visible these structures of oppression. The second barrier is the captivity of our consciousness on gender, which generally, in the West and also elsewhere, is a kind of siloed focus on patriarchy and sexual liberation, right? And then you add the racialized extensions of that, which circumscribe the third world woman. So within all of that, the female fighter has disappeared, right? This is a quote, again, from the book. Patriarchy is enshrined in the state and the society that wraps around it. In a bid to consolidate power, it assumes a Hydra-like form. The body anchored in the patriarchal desire for domination defends itself with multiple heads. Militarization, racism, supremacy. Where misogyny is a hatred of women, racialized supremacy is a hatred of specific women. How do we understand the women confronted with the fiery breath of one of the heads that seeks to extinguish an entire race? Those that choose to fight the enemy that confronts them, the ones fighting not for women's rights, but for the right to exist. The challenge here, there's several challenges in seeing these women, but one of the bigger ones is the construction of this marginalized woman in the developing world as the victim, which largely comes through humanitarian and development discourses. Going deeper into that category of a victim, the book posits that defining an individual through their most often sexualized trauma serves two key purposes. First, the interventions into their lives can be justified as a moral obligation. Second, a sexualized victim is not a political actor. And this is the most important point for me, right? Once you construct a woman as a sexualized victim, you do not expect political action, right? Or the capacity for that has been taken away, right? The capacity to resist. For me, I think about this kind of trauma, particularly sexual violence, as sitting uncomfortably in every woman. A psychologist told me once that each of these acts lodges like shrapnel, embedded and impeding the brain's natural recovery process. So in writing trauma, in writing her, I'm only trying to sketch the contours of that wound, and what that wound does to the formation of political identity. The chapter on sexual violence, which you may have read, focuses on the stage. It focuses on tackling the narrative display of trauma that inevitably orients itself towards the state that is complicit in the violence against her. This is a quote from, or a section from the book from my time in Tunisia, when I was visiting the first tribunal to address the mass sexual violence in the revolution. It's about two women, Mariam and her daughter, Saba. Mariam was born in the shadow of her mother's activism and came of teenage in the Jasmine Revolution. Even after her cold articulation of the facts, Saba still felt the presence of the state police, inside her and on top of her. Her organs ached with the most natural of movements, aging skin layered around stitches. Miriam was young then. She was young then. Listening to her, I wondered, as I often did, how does rape age inside of women as the world around them moves on unbothered? The state, pulling justification from repressive regimes elsewhere, will argue that Saba's detention was administrative, a matter of procedure, not punishment. Miriam remembers trying to identify the offense, clarify the purpose of her sudden absence during her mother's days inside. Had she crossed a cultural barrier as a woman or a political blockade as an activist? Her mother was captured for an act of dissent, but the uniformed man who raped her reminded her she was a woman. Saba's anger now fades in the shadow of her daughter's frustration. She tells me, I think my daughter wants to join the Islamist group in the mountains that is fighting against the government. As elsewhere, the violence that has been formative to the state's history, to its sense of self, will shape the identities of the generations that grow beneath it. Saba rarely sees Miriam's face anymore. It is hidden behind the screen of her laptop. Decorative stickers have been carefully placed around the luminescent apple, Arabic graffiti, and the outline of an AK-47. I cannot understand her choice. Miriam asks why her mother waits in line with other victims outside the tribunal in Tunis. Why go back inside? Why speak her truth to the state that tortured her, Miriam asks. I cannot understand her choice. So it is through this kind of mapping of the intrusive violence and the narratives of the female fighter that the text tries to complicate these feminist concepts of choice and agency. The female fighters I've known are conscious of multiple layers of captivity, from the intimate space of domestic violence to the heavy hand of the state, of state violence, and the links between the two. And that liberation from one is not freedom from all. I argue that the female fighters in rebel movements I've worked with act inside of a kind of restricted agency. Captive women move in slow, slight ways as they twist out of an iron grip. The second challenge of seeing this woman is the impact of this narrow lens on the individual fighter as it overlaps with political ideology and worldviews that shroud her in suspicion. Right? The question of neutrality, of course, was one of the earliest points of disconnect I encountered in the academy and development and policy, and something that I could never reconcile with the evident truth that neither intellectual curiosity nor humanitarian intent is inherently neutral. So objectivity then was the impossible demand made of marginalized communities whose embedded analyses are a threat. No. So we're happy to support the women who either ally or do not threaten Western policy. If she's not someone whose politics we agree with, she exists at this kind of intersection of entrenched gender perceptions and the rise of xenophobia. As a fighter, I've heard her call one of these people a monster, a sociopath. As a woman, she's broken. So she occupies this uncomfortable position, particularly in the aid complex. She's neither a victim to be saved nor entirely an agent of her own actions. So really the task of this book, its political task, is to consider resistance and to consider it through the lens of the female fighter, the link between political identity and collective struggle. And this is a segment from the book. To consider the decision to choose violence as a momentary lapse of rationality is to dismiss the expansive reservoirs of trauma that shape the makeup of the women who do. For the women I have known, political consciousness would form slowly as they move through multiple emotional states to their own political territories. When the violations of the state are intimate, the injury to soft spaces hardens quickly. The female fighter is enraged. Her political identity is shaped by experiences of state violence. She is not defined solely by her trauma. Violence was the only means of political resistance, and she did not seek individual empowerment, rather collective liberation from multiple sources of repression. Of course, there's multiple reasons why women choose violence, but I argue that understanding motivation must be anchored in the role of a political identity shaped by the violence of the state. This, of course, requires a kind of recoding of what we read as political violence, right? Things like displacement, sexual violence, cultural repression, a deeper understanding of how each separately and together forge these political identities. So the book asks, and I'll end with a reading, how does the violence that permeates her life radicalize her? And so the reading I'll end with is from the initial section framed around the battlefield and the idea of advance and retreat. And the reason that I separated these sections like that, and I wrote this in this way, was to be able to understand advance and retreat not only as a military strategy, but as a way to map consciousness. That we move forward and we take time, and the movement took time in that strategic retreat to recalibrate, right? And it's a lot of what I struggle with contemporary activism now, is that space for retreat, that space for critical thinking and strategy is not always there. So the battlefield, advance and retreat. When the women I have known joined the Tigers, they set their lives in multi-directional motion. They would begin to move from home to training camp, from training camp to the base, from the base to the battlefield, to another battlefield and another, until they were taken captive, detained, hidden away, and suddenly still. In any insurgency, this movement is a continuum of conscious resistance. Memories of the aggressive mobility of war are marked with peaceful moments of reflection. Retreat can be read as a symbol of defeat, but it is also strategic, a central part of forward movement. The retreat is both tactical, to preserve resources, and thoughtful, an interlude for critical thinking, analysis, and recentering of political purpose before the next advance. Akila was one of the senior cadre in the Tigers, and this section is about her time in detention at the end of the war. Our madam was middle-aged, her face twisted in ways that mimicked the austerity of the captured female fighters, but Akila felt her physique was unfit for the demands of guerrilla war. When she spoke to the newly gathered Tiger cadre, she sneered, "We should have shot you all in the jungle so we don't have all these problems with you." It might have affected them if they weren't already so broken, and Akila was the only one who understood her English anyways. From what Akila understood, de-radicalization had two components, hard labor and spiritual guidance, the latter more jarring than the former. Akila rolls her eyes as she remembers a forced meditation. The Buddhist monk sent to give spiritual guidance told her he advised the government to execute them. At least you high-level cadre should have been killed. She wonders if they were paid to come in and offer this enlightenment. The lucky ones were made to stand in the sun for hours. Others are charged with positivity through the shock of an electric wire. Life on the inside for Akila was mentally torturous. Waiting for hours in the sun, manual labor, even the occasional brute force of their madam. It felt like we were moving, and then we were paralyzed. In total, there were 3,000 Tiger women in detention. In the early days, she says, the women in the army were afraid of us. Maybe they didn't know that we were afraid of them. One day, the madam figured out that Akila spoke English and was skilled with computers and decided she would be in charge of data entry. This was in the fall of 2009, and the data was names and ID numbers of former cadre, each living or dead, placed into the compact boxes of a 2006 version of Microsoft Excel. The battlefield had changed, and Akila saw her role in front of a screen as a first and final line of defense between the cadre and the state that would extract information by any means necessary. The days passed in waiting, not for release, but for a sighting of the Terrorism Information Department team that selected the ones who would face torture in exchange for information on terror. One morning, a lower-level TID officer came to the computer. He asked Akila for a female cadre by name. Was she there? Akila scrolled through the boxes in front of him. She had already made sure the particular cadre in question was missing from her formatted cell. Saving her was at least some form of resistance, even though we were captured. No? Captive women move in slow, slight ways as they twist out of an iron grip. As they stood still in long lines of forced labor, they were repeatedly told, "You lost the war. You have to move forward." She pauses as she considers the statement. But this, their de-radicalization and how they treat us, it doesn't erase the memories. It only reminds us why we fought. And The last section is Sandra, the female fighter from the Farc. In our conversations, I often mention the theories floating around in the world about the female fighter to get Sandra's immediate, expectedly indignant reaction. She finds even the surprise that women might take up arms a kind of machista attitude. I show her the cover of a book that purports to explain the motivations of a female fighter, Bombshell, a blonde Barbie doll dressed in vaguely ethnic wear accessorized by the belt of suicide bombs. Sandra asked me, these women consider themselves feminists? Her first impression in the training camps was that there was no separation on gender. Work was done as a block. She, as most fighters, is not blind to nor hesitant to address the presence of patriarchy inside the movement. Once the ability to fight one form of oppression is embraced, all oppression reveals itself easily. Things are not perfect inside the movement, she says. There are, of course, machista men. The issue, however, is placed inside the tensions of the struggle that could only be revealed and reckoned with in internal conversations. She insists on the kind of nuance the outside view seems to calculatedly crush. Of course, some men were more thoughtful and made efforts to understand equality. Others didn't. When some men took credit for the work of female cadre, Sandra would fight for visibility. In the end, the men comrades learned that they have underestimated the capability of women. In the collective fight for social justice, which Sandra saw as a gender equalizer, she was one of the few women who crossed over into the realm of military commanders, called on to advise the movement and political strategy. As she recounts her role, she sits up a bit straighter, as if to live up to its import. Having a gun, she says, doesn't make me more or less of a woman. When I meet Akila again, years later, I mention that many people think female fighters have been brainwashed. She smiles slowly. I wonder if perhaps something has gotten lost in translation. I ask again, and she replies, yes, I understood. I was not brainwashed. I was motivated to fight. And I'll end there and take questions or comments.
Thank you so much. Wonderful way to finish your talk, Nimmi, saying that I'm not being brainwashed, but just motivated, which is something that in the global North, we are not used to. We tend, especially when dealing with women militants, right? We tend to believe that they're just being a victim of their organization, right? And being brainwashed to be there, but we never really assume that they might have, obviously, their own nationalist aspirations. So I know that some of my students have questions. Anyone there who would like to make questions for Nimmi, either just turn on your camera or your mic or just use the chat, please.
Hello. First of all, I would like to tell you, Nimmi, that we are very grateful for having the opportunity of talking to you. So my question is, from your own experience, both in Sri Lanka and the US, what kind of differences do you find between how Sri Lankan feminists deal with the topic of the militant woman in the Tamil cause and the way Western feminists represent them?
Question. I think it's a tricky question that requires a kind of, even within the question itself, a kind of nuance, no? So I think one of the answers would be along the lines of class, right? And I think that the class line is one that blurs the distinction between the West and Sri Lanka. No, so if you're talking about particularly feminist scholars who were raised in the capital, who went to Western schools, who were engaged in research that came along with funding that came from the West, right? You actually see that line start to sort of blur between Western perspectives and Sri Lankan scholar perspectives, right? Where there is an embedded knowledge, I think, of the culture and those important sort of questions about the role that culture plays, that's very important that Sri Lankan feminists have. there's also a kind of import of ideas of Western feminism, right? So there have been Sri Lankan feminists too, who I find sort of mimicked a lot of the Western feminist questions in terms of understanding the political agency of these women solely through the lens of women's rights, right? Which to me was not the way that these women saw themselves, right? Again, this is not me saying this is, you know, how I saw them and this is how I want you to see them. But in the time that I spent with them over these 20 years, this is not how they saw the struggle, right? Which is not to say, again, that women's rights didn't enter into their consciousness. They were all very conscious of patriarchy and were working on that inside the movement, right? But you cannot put on them, you can't dismiss the entire politics of a movement on the basis that there wasn't gender equity throughout, right? Because we haven't yet seen any movement, whether you're talking about racial justice, nationalist struggles, Marxist struggles, that have been able to place gender on par with the political ideology. It hasn't happened, no, anywhere. White nationalism, it doesn't exist, no. So to dismiss the political agency of these female fighters is one of the tendencies that I saw in Western feminism, and that did sort of leak into some of the early Sri Lankan sort of scholarship on this subject. That being said, if you look at the scholarship that's coming from, you know, particularly Tamil women in the North and East now, you know, very sort of thoughtful women who not only went through the violence, but are doing the research on ex-combatants who they've known, on families, you know, that scholarship to me is the one that we should be looking to really understand how this kind of complex overlay of sexism, patriarchy, you know, culture, nationalism, ideology, how that works inside these spaces and how that's going to be reckoned with in whatever new form the movement takes, right? And I think that I have a lot of hope for that, you know, like what that's going to look like coming from that group of scholars in that way. And that being said, too, I hope that, you know, in the early introduction, that my work is not read as giving voice to these women. I hope only to illuminate conversations that are being had in spaces that we're not willing to hear. Because the female fighters have written poetry, they have written narrative, they have written journals, you know, and that is coming out also into the world. And so I think that this sort of combination of really embedded work being done by Tamil scholars in the North and East, alongside the sort of emerging translations of some of this female fighter poetry from around the world, really is what we should look to really to understand how these women saw themselves.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. What kind of women inspire you the most? Vayada.
I'm sort of drawn to women who are innately political, but who hold the political struggle central throughout the course of their lives, you know, because it's very easy to lose that. You know, will be moments in everybody's life as an activist, as a scholar, where one can succumb to celebrity, where one can succumb to a kind of, you know, dilution of your politics, of your struggle. And whether it's through the editing of your work or through, you know, a position at a university or through, and the women that inspire me the most are the ones who enter into every decision of what they write, how they behave, what they put forward, thinking about the collective, thinking about the collective political struggle above themselves as an individual. And it's not easy to do. But there are women, you know, who I know now, and I hope I will always know, who continue to inspire me in their just intense commitment to that collective struggle in everything they do.
Thank you. Any other question?
Okay, let's see if this
That's
is
much better. Okay, go ahead.
So we did a little research on you as an author, and according to your biography, currently you are a senior affiliated scholar at Berkeley's University Political Conflict, Gender, and People's Rights Project, as well as the executive producer of the Vice News Women in at War series. Also, you have recently been the senior expert on gender, political voice, and rights for the UN Women ADB benchmark paper on gender and the SDGs gender expert for the United Nations Human Development Report on Afghanistan, a contributing scholar to both the countering violent extremism and sexual violence policy projects at the United States Institute of Peace, a senior research fellow at the Center for Conflict Negotiation and Recovery, and a policy consultant and analyst for the Center of Humanitarian Dialogue and the International Crisis Group, researching and analyzing gender inclusion in peace building and women's insecurities in conflict zones. And finally, you were also formerly the director of South Asia programs and UN representative for Operation USA. So after all of these, from your experience, in all of these bodies, I am interested in knowing if humanitarian aid and reports on women's status have a real and positive impact on women in the Tamil cause.
It's an important question. All of that is correct, except for Vice, which I left for political reasons. It was a very, very white, very patriarchal space. Do I think that humanitarian reports and policy reports have an impact on Tamil women? Is that the question?
Yes, if it has a real and positive impact.
It has an impact. I don't know that it has a positive impact. I think that, one of the reasons that I stay engaged in policy is because I have seen how these things that we think of as just a briefing that gets submitted at the State Department or at the United Nations or at, an NGO consortium, I've seen how what happens there, that policy really impacts the everyday life of these women, right? That the issue for me has always been that you have DC, you have New York, you have Geneva, right? And then you have these women in the Northeast, and the space between not just geographic space, but the intellectual space and the empathetic space, between how we understand how each of these policies deeply impacts the women in these spaces, right? There's no real ability to offer marginalized women a complex identity, right? So there's a paper that I wrote with colleagues called Emissaries of Empowerment. It's a white paper, and it essentially was building on this work after 20 years and saying, look, this idea of empowerment is fundamentally depoliticizing, right? And I can say that from the vantage point of having done this work, right? Having given out the chickens and sewing machines and cows and all of that, right? And I think, so it ranges from depoliticizing, which is a form of harm. This is the status quo, the way things are now, right? To doing nothing, to actually being quite damaging. In some cases, some of these reports, and the one that comes to mind is a crisis group report that I did. And in 2010, or 2011, I was interviewing the women who were affected by the mass rape at the end of the war. And I must have done 100 interviews in Europe and Sri Lanka, and I'm here asking these women about the worst thing that's happened to them in graphic detail. And then I have to triangulate it with a doctor and with a witness and, create this evidence that really is going to go in one line of one paragraph in a report that will be given to Hillary Clinton's intern, most likely. Right. So what that whole process, the consciousness around it for me, around that moment and thinking through, what am I doing here? Why am I accessing this pain, extracting this pain for what? And so that's why the magazine now, the Adi magazine that was mentioned at the beginning, is very important to me, because part of what's wrong with policy is the way that they write policy. It's this dead, kind of dry, coming from political science, all of the emotional life, the experience of policy out of it. It strips the life from the words itself, right? And that's what makes the policies ineffective. So Eddie Magazine was started, or I started it in order to rehumanize policy, in order to get folks from these spaces, largely women writers, to narrate and to present through political expression, whether it's poetry or other things, how these policies have shaped their lives. No, so that's my interest now, is in infusing policy, enforcing policy to reckon with the intimate impact of violence.
All right, any other question? Okay, Marta says here in the chat, are militant women given a chance to participate in politics?
Again, I'm afraid I have a question for your question, which is what form of politics? Like, are they given a chance to participate in, state level parliament? Even there, probably not. But I don't actually, that to me is not the goal. The goal is not to have 6 Afghan women in the parliament that is already sort of weighted in a kind of patriarchy and US funding that doesn't allow her to move. Now, the goal is not to take women and put them in spaces where they're already, they're going to be constrained, right? Because you only want her there to have a woman in that space, to have someone who's peaceful, to have someone who's democratic, to have whatever, right? And even then, she's usually only allowed to comment on debates happening around development or women's savings programs, and not really about militarization, right? So the inclusion of women into spaces, institutions that are so heavily weighted in every form of ism is not really the political goal for me, right? It is to sort of take seriously and expand that space of informal politics, of non-state politics, right? And what that looks like, we might not immediately recognize. It might not be 6 members of parliament, right? But it might be women organizing in villages in ways that even they don't see as political, but they are political actions, right? To me, that is what you want to see much more of, not necessarily putting more women on the ballot to enter into state level politics where everything about their own identities is constrained.
Thank you. Any other question?
Yes. Hello, Nimmi. Do you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. First of all, it's a great pleasure to be with you, and I'm glad to listen to you. And my question is, in class, we have listened to you with Sandra and Linda at the Feminist Freedom Warrior Project. There, you said that democracy is a disguise to cover up a lot of violence. I've noticed that Sri Lanka has had members of the same family, the Rajapaksa as presidents or in charge of ministries. I am interested in knowing, under this type of democracy, there is a freedom of expression, or if you or other writers has suffered from censorship. Thank you very much.
It wouldn't affect me, right? The Sri Lankan government wouldn't have the ability to censor me. But absolutely, there are Tamil writers who not only have, and dissenting voices actually more broadly, not just Tamils, who are not only facing censorship, but actual threat to life. I mean, we've had a number of journalists abducted, killed, with still no, assumed to be by the government, with still no trials, no recourse for their families. My interest in that conversation that you're speaking of wasn't pointing out the US commitment to a facade of democracy, right? And how deeply problematic that is in allowing impunity to continue for a number of states, right? It was true in Myanmar, it remains true in Myanmar, it's true in Sri Lanka, that as soon as a government sort of assumes the language of democracy, even in its most sort of superficial forms, even if it can't be found in any of their institutions where you have a Supreme Court entirely appointed by the central government, right? The actual sort of practice of democracy and the life of sort of democratic conversations doesn't exist inside these republics, right? It absolutely didn't exist in Myanmar, but the US is so committed, and Europe, to protecting the facade of democracy that they actually end up supporting these regimes that are deeply authoritarian, right? And by supporting, I mean military support, financial support, and they are encouraging the militarization and the authoritarian sort of nature of these regimes, which do a very good job of articulating democracy, right? None of these countries, of course, not the United States either, can be considered to be a fully functioning democracy, not even close, right? But they're very good at sort of erecting that scaffolding for the rest of the world to see, right? And that's what protects them from things like, outside investigations into war crimes, which is what this government is accused of. So, yeah, I mean, I think that this is a big, particularly in policy circles, this commitment to the idea of democracy that in practice does not exist is very, very dangerous because it comes alongside with US funding.
Thank you very much.
Any other question?
Yes, I would like to ask that how can victims of sexual violence become empowered and stand up for their cause?
My views on this are somewhat controversial. There's a part of the book and there's an essay that you can find in Guernica called The Trouble with Trauma. I think a lot of the conversation on sexual violence, which of course perhaps started in the West and spread elsewhere, is anchored in the idea of trauma-based mobilizing. This is something that I fundamentally feel is not politically effective. Because when particularly younger women put their trauma out in the world publicly, it's available to be manipulated by other political agendas, right? Most of the young people I work with, and certainly coming from my experience with fighters, that trauma is one that is held inside of them, right? It's held inside of a particular political project. Of course, it's recognized, of course, it's dealt with. But when you enter into a world where, sexual violence becomes, in a lot of these countries, the only way to access resources, right? So women have to publicly claim sexual violence to get food, to get a sewing machine, to get livelihood support, right? So they have to sort of enter into this immediate victimhood, that gets them really no closer to the question of justice, because it doesn't tackle the reasons why sexual violence happens, right? Sexual violence happens, particularly if you look at the case of Sri Lanka, mass sexual violence happened because of an increase of militarization, right? Militarization was the reason why women were more vulnerable. That's not going to be tackled by giving a bunch of women sewing machines. No. So for me, victims of sexual violence, I would follow the model that a lot of the fighters I knew followed, which was, yes, that pain is there and it's a horrible pain, but the assumption that putting that out in the world is going to end sexual violence, right? Rather than keeping it inside your own political project so it can't be manipulated by others, right? And we saw this in the United States. I'm not sure how many of you are following, but with the Supreme Court nominee last year or the year before, you had this trauma-based mobilizing to say, this guy engaged in sexual assault and he engaged this, and all of the women's rights movements were out in force. And the final deciding vote was a woman US Congress from Maine. And she was the one to make the decision. And she essentially said to all these women, I see your trauma, but I have a political agenda, which is to increase the budget of Homeland Security, which is to keep immigrants out of the country. So I'm going to vote for him to enter into the Supreme Court, despite your trauma-based resistance, because I want my political agenda to be passed, right? Now, had there been a movement against this nominee on the basis of his politics, we might have seen a different outcome, right? So, I don't think there's one pathway that one can recommend to somebody who has experienced that. For me, I look at it more broadly at a bigger level in terms of how it's operating in society and discourse and activism right now. And generally, I would urge, women in particular, to not so easily make their trauma available to others to manipulate.
Thank you very much.
Any other question in the audience?
I have one question. We know that the war is over, but is the cause alive? I mean, how are younger generation educated and indoctrinated?
I'm going to go with educated instead of indoctrinated. There's absolutely the Tamil struggle is, in my opinion, very much alive in ways that continue to have a depth that surprised me. I had the opportunity after the war to visit a number of diaspora communities around the world. And I hear a lot, you hear a lot of negativity about diasporas being involved in conflicts back home and not really understanding. But what I saw in those weeks of traveling and meeting with folks was simply a dedication to a people. It was some of whom had experienced violence and left, some of whom had lost family members, some of whom had never experienced violence. But that commitment to your people, to the Tamil people, right? I saw folks who were engineers working till 7 at night and staying up till 2 in the morning on conference calls. I saw young people organizing in Toronto. They shut down the highways there. You still see young people organizing, Tamil young people, now including, queer folks and various forms of artists, and the expansion of political expression to me is incredible to watch. The innovative, nature of resistance that we always see. There's no people that would be held down for very long because that will always be there. So I think absolutely this next generation is motivated. There's certainly a debate as to how to move forward, but they're incredibly thoughtful and they're incredibly passionate, both on the island and off. So for me, there's a lot of hope. And, one of the projects that was referenced that we're working on is an archive at Berkeley on the legacies of violence in South Asia and sort of mapping this violence from the perspective of women and the perspective of civilians. And in doing this work and in holding these archives, it's really helped me to situate myself in the struggle, right? Because no matter what, how sort of self-aware you are, one always feels that you can change. That's the reason you do this work. But in sitting with these materials, it really forces you to see that the struggle existed long before you and will continue long after you're gone, right? This is just your moment in this struggle. And then within that, you find what your role is, which may not be marching on the streets, which may not be protesting at the UN. It may be something very different, but all of it is useful in the struggle, right? And I do think that young Tamil people in particular are finding that. They're each finding their role in the struggle. So it will look different, but there will be a resistance.
Thank you.
Any other question? All right. So I think we can finish our session here. Nimmi, thank you so much. It's been wonderful to have you here, and from what I've heard from my students with so many questions, they really enjoyed having you with them. It's not the same, right? When you're reading a work and then meet the author and actually be able to make direct questions to her. So I really appreciate that. And well, if somebody wants to say something before we leave, it's time to do so.
I'm very grateful for the space. This book, of course, is a political project, and to get to, despite COVID and all that, in various ways, carry it out into the world, and to have the conversations that come with it was part of the motivation to write the book. So I'm very grateful for the space to do that.
Thank you for writing it. Should we expect a second book soon?
There's essays coming out.
Oh, okay.
There's some work. The new work is on the obstetric violence at the border here in the United States. So the state-sponsored kind of obstetric violence around migrant women that's tied to eugenics and the old eugenics laws of this country. And so there'll be some long essays, I think, before there's another book project. Those are a lot of work, the book projects. They take a long time. Yeah.
Sounds wonderful. Yeah, I can't wait to read that.
Yeah.
All the best.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Take care.
Yeah, take care. Bye.